During the Great Depression, American families kept their homes warm through the worst winters on record, burning almost nothing. Not because they were lucky, because they knew something about heat that your utility company would prefer you never learned. There was one family in rural Ohio in 1934 whose neighbors froze. Their pipes burst. Their livestock died. But this family, with less firewood than anyone on their street, made it through February without a single cold night. Nobody could explain it at the time, and the explanation, when it finally came, raised a question that is still not fully answered today. Keep that family in mind. We will come back to them. The winter of 1933 into 1934 was not the coldest winter on record. But for families already stripped of savings, already burning furniture to stay warm, already rationing food, it did not need to be the coldest. It only needed to be cold enough. Government records from that period show something interesting. In rural counties across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, hospital admissions for hypothermia were not evenly distributed. Some communities lost people. Others did not. And the difference was not always wealth. Some of the poorest families in those counties made it through with almost no fuel expenditure at all. Researchers who looked at this decades later expected to find the answer in geography. Maybe certain areas were simply more sheltered. But the geography did not explain it. Neither did house size. Neither did family size. What it came down to, in county after county, was knowledge. Specific, practical, almost mechanical knowledge about how heat actually behaves inside an enclosed space. But why were certain Depression-era families paying nothing for heat while their neighbours burned through their entire wood supply by January? The answer had nothing to do with the size of their house or how much firewood they had stored. It had to do with something they understood about heat that most people today have completely forgotten. And when you hear it, you will immediately wonder why nobody taught you this. Here is what they understood. Heat does not stay where you put it. Heat moves. It rises, it radiates, it conducts through every surface it touches, and if those surfaces are wrong, it leaves the building before it ever reaches a human body. Most people in the 1930s learned this not in school, but by necessity, by watching what worked and what did not, by surviving. The principle they applied was called zone heating, though they did not call it that. They called it common sense. Instead of attempting to heat an entire structure, they identified the smallest livable space in the home, usually one central room, and they made that room airtight. Airtight, because warm air in a leaking room is money burning through the walls. Warm air in a sealed room compounds. It stays. They sealed door gaps with rags. They hung wool blankets across door frames. They covered single-pane windows, not with curtains, but with layers of oilcloth, and in some cases brown paper bags layered and pressed together. A material that, when layered correctly, has an insulating value that modern engineers have since confirmed is not trivial. But that only explains part of it. The other part is stranger, and it involves a decision that seems completely backwards until you understand the physics. Everything you believe about home heating is based on one assumption, that you need to heat the entire house. That assumption is costing you hundreds of dollars every single winter. The families who survived the Depression rejected it entirely. And the reason modern homes are actually less efficient than a 1932 farmhouse is something the construction industry has never publicly acknowledged, because the answer is embarrassing. A well-built Depression-era farmhouse in the Midwest had walls packed with materials that were chosen not for aesthetics and not for speed of construction, but because they worked. Corn cobs. Animal hair mixed into plaster. Newspaper packed into cavities and sealed with linseed oil. These materials were available, they were free, and they performed. The thermal resistance of a properly packed sawdust wall, when measured in modern laboratory conditions, falls within a range that meets or exceeds certain current building standards. That is not an opinion. That is a measured physical fact. The reason modern building codes actually made homes less efficient than a 1932 farmhouse is something the construction industry has never publicly acknowledged. Here is what happened. After the Second World War, construction scaled up rapidly to meet housing demand. Speed became the priority. The materials that Depression-era families had packed into their walls by hand, materials that took time, that required local sourcing, that could not be manufactured in a plant and shipped on a pallet, those materials were abandoned. Not because they failed, because they were inconvenient. They were replaced with materials that were faster to install, easier to manufacture, and, critically, purchased rather than sourced. That transition was good for the construction supply industry. It was not necessarily good for the homeowner. And here is what makes that uncomfortable. The materials they replaced were not replaced because they stopped working. They were replaced because they were cheap. And cheap meant there was no profit in them. Which raises a question nobody in the industry wants to answer directly. Nay. Now, the Ohio family. What they were doing was discovered not by a researcher, but by a county extension agent named Harold Mercer, who visited the property in the spring of 1934. He had been sent to check on families who had been reported as at risk. He found them in better condition than most families with significantly more resources. What he documented in his field notes, notes that sat in a county archive in Licking County for decades before anyone looked at them carefully, was this. The family had divided their home into two zones. The outer zone, which included the kitchen, the back rooms, and the entry, deliberately kept cold. Not accidentally cold, because they understood that a cold outer zone acts as a buffer. It slows the transfer of heat from the warm inner zone to the exterior. The cold room becomes insulation. The house becomes a system rather than a single space. They maintained their central room at a temperature that required roughly 1/3 of the fuel their neighbours burned. They slept in that room. They cooked in that room. When temperatures outside dropped below zero for 9 consecutive nights in early February, their inner room did not drop below 58 degrees. That is what the Ohio family knew. But there is one detail from that case that the local historical record never explained. And when you look at it carefully, it suggests they knew something even more specific. Something that was never written down. Mercer's field notes mention briefly that the father refused to explain where he had learned the method. He said only that it was older than he was. That is the last reference to the origin of the technique in any record connected to that family. The family name appears once more in county records in 1937, and then not again. Where the knowledge came from, And how many other families were using variations of the same system remains genuinely unclear. That's the citoyen. What has been confirmed across multiple independent sources from that period is that the families who made it through those winters shared a set of practices that have since been either forgotten or made structurally impossible by modern building design. Open floor plans. Forced air systems that push heat through an entire structure uniformly. Homes designed to be heated as single zones, because single-zone heating requires a continuously operating system, and a continuously operating system requires a continuously paid utility bill. The farmhouse that warmed itself in sections required nothing but knowledge and 30 minutes of preparation. The techniques are not gone. They are sitting in old farmhouse walls, in county historical records, in the margins of notebooks that nobody has opened in 60 years. The families who used them are mostly gone. But the physics has not changed. The question is not whether these methods work. The question is why, in an era of record energy costs and aging infrastructure, we stopped asking about them. And who benefits from that silence?